Turning now to one of the top stories that we were following for you on this Friday, and that is those talks that were being held by U.S. and Iranian officials over in Oman. I want to take us out to this, just some of the footage that we had over in Muscat where those talks were being held, and the Associated Press saying this, that Iran and the United States held indirect talks today as negotiations appeared to return to the starting point on how to approach discussions over Tehran's nuclear program. But for the first time, America brought its top military commander in the Middle East to the table. President Trump has repeatedly threatened to use force to compel Iran to reach a deal on the program, after earlier sending the carrier to the region over Tehran's bloody crackdown on nationwide protests that killed thousands and saw tens of thousands of others detained in the Islamic Republic. Joining us now to discuss this even further is Dave Lawler. He is a national security editor at Axios. Dave, good to have you on.
Great to be with you.
So let's just start with the basics here for all of our viewers at home in case they haven't seen those recent headlines. What do we know about those talks? What came out of them today?
Yeah, so it is interesting the degree to which they're still talking about how to talk about all of this. I mean, a very preliminary meeting from what we know about it. There was discussion of whether they were only going to be talking about Iran's nuclear program or whether there was going to be a wider sort of basket of issues on the table. The Iranians say they only talked about nuclear weapons, that it was a positive meeting, and that they had to go back to their respective capitals to decide how to move forward with this process. So from that description, you're talking about a very slow-moving, plodding diplomatic process. At the same time, the U.S. has this massive array of firepower in the Gulf, with President Trump saying if there's not a deal quickly, he could choose military action. So it feels like there's two tracks that don't align perfectly. President Trump saying we need a deal now, and these negotiations, again, being very early stage, seemingly nowhere near a deal.
Now, Dave, I mentioned off the top that you are the national security editor at Axios, so I want to focus from that perspective for a bit here. I want to ask, how do intelligence and defense agencies they assess Iran's current nuclear and regional capabilities as they head into these negotiations and the ones in the future?
Sure. So you'll remember that the U.S. Took strikes in Iran back in June that destroyed a lot of the above ground and some of the underground nuclear facilities at which Iran had been enriching uranium. So at the moment, their capacity to quickly break out toward a bomb, if they so chose, seems to be pretty limited. What they do still have is quite a bit of highly enriched uranium, and they have the know-how to sort of progress their program again. So President Trump's view is that they pushed back this threat, but they haven't completely taken it off the table. So a nuclear deal could potentially, again, make sure that Iran, once they rebuild some of that capacity, that they don't then decide to move toward a bomb. You mentioned their other regional capabilities. What they do have is a whole lot of ballistic missiles, and they have a network of proxy groups in the region. That many of those have been weakened significantly over the last couple of years, but still, they do have military capabilities. And President Trump has said before that if he's going to get a deal with Iran, it's got to address the missiles, it's got to address the regional activity. Iran still says they will only talk about nukes. So again, we're still in the what's even on the table stage of the negotiations right now.
This is a social media post from Jennifer Griffin at Fox News in which she says, a source, negotiations in Oman between Iranian and U.S. officials were face-to-face, first time since U.S. bombed Iran's nuclear sites in June. Iranian officials said they lasted 8 hours. I want to cite some reporting from the Associated Press also, Dave, with this next question. So they had written this, that in an unusual development, U.S. Navy Admiral Brad Cooper, the head of the American military's Central Command, also attended the meeting, something that did not happen in previous rounds. Now, was that surprising to you, and what does it signal?
I think what it signals is that the U.S. wants to make Iran very aware that there is a military option. The USS Abraham Lincoln, the aircraft carrier, and its strike group is sitting there in the Gulf. President Trump has made very clear that he sees this as giving him a whole lot of options when it comes to targeting Iran's leadership potentially, or just Iranian government targets in general. I'm not sure Admiral Cooper was there to make direct threats against the regime, but you have to imagine for the Iranian foreign ministry representatives to have a U.S. admiral in uniform at these talks perhaps sends a certain signal their way. And again, I don't know whether they needed some sort of technical military know-how in the talks. I would assume that it's perhaps in part at least a symbolic gesture to have the admiral take a seat at the table.
I would be remiss if we didn't talk a little bit about the location of where these talks were happening, which was in Oman. Dave, can you provide some insight to our viewers? Why were these talks held in Oman? What do they play when it comes to being mediators during this conversation?
Yeah, very interesting question. I think the backstory there is just as interesting as whatever happened today. Basically, these talks were going to happen in Turkey. There was an agreement to hold the talks in Turkey, and then the Iranians said, wait, 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 we actually want to do it in Oman. There was a back and forth. The meeting was almost canceled, and then they just decided to go ahead and do it. The Omanis have relatively close ties with both the Iranians and the U.S., one of the very few countries that does have strong relations with both parties. What the Iranians didn't want to have was this gathering in Turkey with other regional players, all of which have their own problems with Iran and can potentially work together to put additional pressure on Iran. They said it's just us, the U.S., and the Omanis in the room, the Omanis serving as a neutral mediator, a quiet setting. Muscat, I've never been, but I understand it's not as much of an international hub as Istanbul. And these were sort of low key talks, which again did take place over the course of many, many hours today. But I think it's interesting the sort of more understated setting and the role of the Omanis as the mediating party between the two.
This is just some of the footage from down there in Muscat to give a sense as to what it looks like there on the ground. We did not get any footage from inside those talks or anything like that, but just to give our viewers a little more perspective. I want to put up this also, a social media post here. This is courtesy of Reuters. So take a look at this. It says, Iran has rejected U.S. calls to halt uranium enrichment on its territory during talks in Oman on Friday. A regional diplomat briefed by Tehran told Reuters, but said it was willing to discuss the level and purity of enrichment or regional consortium. That brings me to my next question here, Dave, which is when we think about just some of the challenges that each of these sides have to overcome, what do you think is most pressing at the moment, and what is going to be the most difficult part to get through?
So, from my perspective, when you have the Iranians taking so much off the table right off the bat, we won't talk about anything beyond nuclear weapons. And even when it comes to nuclear weapons, we still need to retain domestic enrichment capability. There's really not much room for a grand bargain of the sort that President Trump has talked about before. So it's a question of whether they think they just can't go there. It doesn't make sense for their government to go to the lengths that President Trump is probably looking for to make a deal. Maybe they don't take the military threat as seriously as many others in the region do. Again, many people are worried this could turn into a regional war pretty quickly. Or I don't know, maybe the negotiators just don't feel like they've been given much wiggle room by the supreme leader over there. But I just, the party seems so far apart right now on what a deal would look like coming out of this. I just don't see the gaps between the two of them narrowing on the kind of timeline that President Trump has talked about. So it's a bit of a puzzle when you look at this picture and think the Iranians are only willing to talk about, this very limited set of issues. The U.S., at least officially, wants a much more ambitious agreement. The talks are so preliminary right now, and yet you've got a U.S. aircraft carrier sitting off the coast, apparently locked and loaded. Something's got to give at some point. And again, I don't know what's in President Trump's head at the moment, but I certainly would not underestimate the possibility that he might decide diplomacy isn't going to work, and the military option is the way to go. So it's very possible we're looking at a much different situation in the coming days. I should say both sides came out of these talks and said they do expect to meet again. So it wasn't a breakdown in Oman. They do expect to continue talking, but again, they look pretty far apart right now.
And Dave, there's so many different points that we could go in depth on in regards to this entire conversation, but I'm just gonna, leave you with this final question, which is obviously as someone that covers this extensively and who follows this story very closely, is there anything in particular that you think is not being talked about enough or that you really have your eye on as we wait for this next round of talks?
One thing to watch, President Trump has been pretty clear that he would like to speak directly to the Supreme Leader. It's all well and good to have his envoys, Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner, meet the foreign minister. But the political setup in Iran, the president and the officials who work for him, including the foreign minister, they don't have the level of decision making, authority that certainly the Supreme Leader has, and that maybe people who are actually closer in his inner orbit have. And so President Trump has said, let's cut out the middleman. I want to talk directly to the Supreme Leader. The Iranians have been unwilling to do that so far. I'm curious to see if that changes at any point, whether the Supreme Leader is willing to engage directly with Trump, or whether another track opens up beyond this sort of Witkoff Aragchi, who's the Iranian foreign minister, beyond that track. So that's something I'm watching for in the coming days and weeks.
Dave Lawler, national security editor at Axios. We appreciate your time here at Live Now from Fox. There's still a lot to look out for within the next several weeks, possibly, when it comes to new developments. So we look forward to checking in with you soon.
Thanks so much.